This is
Make It Plain.
Make It Plain.
MIP
With Masamela Matfumo.
Mark Thompson.
Make It Plain.
Get woke.
God bless you. Get woke. Folks, MIP is now COVID-free, meaning free to all subscribers as we navigate this pandemic. We're thinking about everyone, and we've got to get through this together. So for a limited time, no fee to subscribe to Make It Plain on your favorite podcast app. Folks, tomorrow is the big day, the Mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington, the culmination of the Poor People's Campaign. It's going to be streaming live. It's a digital gathering. 10 a.m. tomorrow, June 20th, 6 p.m. June 20th. It'll re-air, and then at 6 p.m. again on June 21st on Sunday. You can register at june2020.org, but get up bright and early with us in the morning and join us at 10 a.m. for the Mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington. And so right now we're going to have the last of our daily installments of personal stories from the Poor People's Campaign. To hear what some of these people have had to go through is incredible. So we're going to share one more with you today on the eve of tomorrow's Mass Poor People's Assembly. Here today we have India from Dermot, Arkansas. Here's India from Dermot, Arkansas.
My name is India, and I'm a 38-year-old mother of five, wife, teacher, nonprofit founder, and community advocate from a small town, rural town of Dermot, Arkansas. In 2017, the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette released an article that said, the rights of renters in Arkansas can be counted on one hand, even if that hand is missing a couple of fingers. This was not an understatement. I've experienced the devastating impact firsthand for 10 years. Arkansas is the only state in the U.S. where landlords do not have an obligation to provide a habitable dwelling place. Arkansas is the only state in the U.S. where landlords are not required to make home repairs, so they often refuse. I've woken up in the morning to use the restroom, and when I flushed the toilet, feces came out of the faucet straight into the tub. When this happened, I had to hurry up and clean it because this is the same tub that my children need to get ready for school in every morning. You think that this could only happen once, but this was my experience in not one, not two, but 3 different homes I rented that were owned by 3 different landlords. I also faced unwanted, inappropriate sexual advances from a landlord, only to have him come into my home with his key unannounced to make unnecessary repairs while leaving the repairs that we truly needed untouched. These are just a few of the things Arkansans renters endure. And the global coronavirus pandemic, Arkansas renters are even more susceptible to the predatory landlords because we must stay in our homes. These dangerous, unempathetic practices are part of a system that has been set up by the privileged and wealthy against and to the detriment of me and all of the working class poor people. But what they did not count on was us galvanizing our collectives, us drawing strength from those who came before us unifying, standing shoulder to shoulder, empowering each other, us loving to get in good trouble, and us being that new and unsettling force who will not stop until we have safe housing for all people and for future generations to come. Forward together, not one step back.
It's India of Dermot, Arkansas, and that's her story. The last of our installments in Poor People's Campaign Personal Stories. Tomorrow, the big day, 10 a.m. Eastern, June2020.org. Get registered and tune in to see live the Mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Juneteenth. And in thinking of who we chat with today, I wanted to bring someone back on the show who in the past has served the role on the show as a historian, but that was his calling. He graduated from South Carolina State in 1962 with his BS degree in history, and he was a social studies teacher in Charleston, South Carolina. Once a history professor, always a history professor. We all know him most now as the representative from South Carolina, the first to be elected since Reconstruction to Congress, the first African American. And he also is the House Majority Whip. But the hat he's wearing today, as I said, is history professor as we recognize Juneteenth. The Honorable James Clyburn joins us once again on Make It Plain. Good to see you, Doctor. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much for having me back.
Yes, sir. I want this to be your classroom. And, obviously a lot of people are talking about Juneteenth, even folk who've never known about it before. It's popular this year for good reasons and bad, obviously for all the things that we've been facing this year in this pandemic and police-demic. But from your perspective as a history professor, from those who don't know, and from you being a teacher in the classes you taught, talk to us about Juneteenth and what you've imparted to your students over the years.
Well, thank you once again for having me. The thing that I like most to talk about when it comes to Juneteenth is its origin. As most of us are aware, the Emancipation Proclamations, and I'm putting an S on that because people seem not to realize there were two. One that freed Blacks in the District of Columbia. And there was a second one written in 1862, but made to be effective January 1, 1863. So Abraham Lincoln signed two Emancipation Proclamations freeing slaves. Now, the second one, effective January 1, 1863, freed Blacks in the former slave states. I know we're being a bit technical here, but that's what it did. It meant that if you were held in slavery in any other state, not a slave state, you were still not freed. That's why we had to have the 13th Amendment. And those people who may have watched the movie Lincoln, you saw that the big battle, that movie was about the battle of getting the 13th Amendment. Abraham Lincoln knew exactly what he was doing. He did everything he could to get the 13th Amendment passed because he knew two things. First, he had not freed all Blacks. And he knew, secondly, that the moment he stepped out of office, the executive order, you see, the Emancipation Proclamation was not legislation passed by Congress. It was an executive order by the President of the United States. Executive orders are very powerful. A lot of people don't realize the armed services were integrated by an executive order by Harry Truman in 1948. So, but executive orders die with the president. The next president, unless he or she renews it, he will not be operative. So here we are, January 1, 1863, all Blacks in the former slave states, of which Texas was one, were freed, except for the fact that it was not communicated to all Blacks. So Juneteenth comes about because it was on June 19th 1865, that General Granger went to Galveston, Texas, to inform the slaves there that they were free. Count it up. January 1, 1863 is when the Emancipation Proclamation became effective, and blacks in Texas were free, except nobody communicated it to them, and they didn't know. So I like to talk about Juneteenth as being an example of the importance of communicating. So if a thing happened, there's old adage that they use in law schools a lot. If a tree falls in the woods and nobody is there to hear it, does it make a sound? That's the case. So if blacks were freed and nobody told them, do they have any freedom? Mm-hmm. And so that's what Juneteenth is all about. That's the day that General Granger freed the blacks in Galveston, Texas.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So now, just to go back now, the Second Emancipation Proclamation went into effect January 1st, 1863.
That's correct.
What year was the 13th Amendment passed and ratified?
Oh, I was afraid you were going to ask me that question. If G.K. Butterfield were here for me, he would smack me if I remember it. It's so funny about that because G.K. Butterfield loves to talk about who ratified the 13th Amendment, because these amendments have to be ratified state by state. And so the date that it passed and the date it became effective, there's a long distance between the date that Congress approved the 13th Amendment and the last state that ratified. And North Carolina played a critical role in that. I don't know if they were the last state or the first state to ratify the 13th Amendment, but I don't remember the year at the moment.
Well, so I'm looking at it. It's what I thought it was. I just wanted to be sure. It was in 1865. So on
the 13th Amendment was ratified before Juneteenth, is what you're telling me.
So the 13th Amendment passed the House of Representatives on January 31st, 1865. So right. So the final ratification was not until December 6th of 1865.
Okay.
But so in between there is when Juneteenth happened. But obviously, those who were enslaved in Texas, I think that's the point, neither knew about 1863 or January of 1865. So they didn't know about the second proclamation, and they didn't know about the first passage of the act even before it was ratified. I don't know when Texas actually ratified the 13th Amendment. I do know that Mississippi just ratified it a few years ago. Lord have mercy.
There are some who claim that South Carolina never did. There is this theory that's going around. I've never really verified this, and I've tried to find out whether or not it's true, that what South Carolina technically did was to incorporate the wording of the 13th Amendment into the South Carolina Constitution's Fifth Amendment. And when they adopted their own Fifth Amendment as a constitution, they prevailed upon the federal government to recognize that as having been accepting the 13th Amendment. I've never been able to determine that to really be true, but that's what some of the experts say. I just study history. I love history.
Yes,
I
sir.
used to teach it. I don't call myself a historian by any means.
Well, okay, so Texas actually itself did not ratify the 13th Amendment until February of 1870. I mean, there was enough for it to be ratified by the other states, but Texas itself didn't ratify it.
Well, remember, every state does not have to.
Right.
Yeah, you know, if what is it, 2/3?
Yes,
Yeah.
2/3. And so there were fewer states back then.
Still wait. That's right.
Yeah. So you have taught history for so long, and you've known our history. When did you first come to know about Juneteenth and its importance? I mean, I know it's very popular now. It's very popular in the midst of, but I remember when folk never even heard of it. When did you first realize its importance?
I was a college student.
Okay.
Before I knew about Juneteenth. Really, when I first learned about Juneteenth, I thought that it was June 19th, 1863. It was not until I started doing the research and I found out that no, it was not the June 19th, 1865. I thought they got the word 6 months later. Nope, they got the word 2 years and 6 months later, 30 months.
Wow. Now, what I'm also looking at too, and again, I don't know how accurate this is, but there's something here that says South Carolina ratified in November of 1865.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. The question is, did South Carolina take a direct vote on the ratification, or did they incorporate that language into the state's constitution? I think it's the Fifth Amendment to the state constitution. Whether or not that was considered to be ratification, that is the thing that there's debate on. Now, having not been present, I don't know exactly how technical that was. But you know, people get, especially when we have these false doctrines of history, people get real touchy about whether or not to vote on something directly. We still do that in the Congress. There are a lot of times things are incorporated in the piece of legislation that is allowed to become law without having to have a direct vote on it, so people can maintain plausible deniability. So I suspect a lot of South Carolinians did not want ever it to be said that they voted for ratification, and maybe it was something like that. I don't know. I've never gotten that deep into it.
So I'm curious, if we're looking at 1865, and I know you know this history well too, how long or how close to 1865 was South Carolina's congressional delegation that looked like us, that represented us? And
the first African American to be elected to Congress was from South Carolina.
Right.
Now, let's get this history right.
Okay.
The first African American elected to Congress was from South Carolina, Joseph Rainey. Now, that was 1870, December, in a special election, December 1870. So come December 2020, we're going to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the first Black person being elected to Congress. And we're going to have a big ceremony there in the Capitol. We're going to have a big display dedicated to him. And I am hopeful that I get it done by then. There is a room on the first floor that I'm trying to get named in honor of Joseph Rainey, who was originally from Georgetown, South Carolina, but having gone to Bermuda, running away from slavery, came back to this country after Emancipation Proclamation and lived in Charleston when he came back. Now, the reason I emphasize the election part is because back then, there were 2 Black United States senators. One from Louisiana, one from Mississippi. And of course, they were not elected, popularly elected. They were elected by the Senate of their state.
Right.
And sent to Washington to represent
and that's
them.
how they did it back then, just to be clear.
That's right.
They hadn't started popular election of senators yet.
That's exactly right.
Mm-hmm. And back then, too, that was possible because you had state legislatures during Reconstruction where we as African Americans had won seats.
Oh, had a lot of seats. In fact, in South Carolina, 2/3 of the General Assembly in South Carolina was Black.
Mm-hmm.
The vast majority of the House of Representatives was Black. But we never had a majority in the state Senate. But in the state House of Representatives, it was majority Black. And if my memory serves on this, we had 4 Congress people, and 3 of them were Black.
Right, including I think Robert Elliott.
Yes,
and
Robert Elliott, who was the Speaker of the State House of Representatives here in South Carolina, but he went on to Congress. In fact, it's technically Reconstruction lasts only 12 years.
Yeah,
we often refer to that period all the way up to the 1890s as being the Reconstruction period. The fact of the matter is, the Reconstruction lasts from 1865 and was over in 1877. So Reconstruction came to end in 1877, largely on legislation being passed. One was a Supreme Court decision in 1872 involving Louisiana, Cruikshank case, and then the Pleasant versus Ferguson case put in law, separate but equal. That was 1896. That case, and that's the period. It was when that case was decided that people tended to say this was the ending of Reconstruction and the beginning of separate but equal. No, Jim Crow started after around 1877 and lasted all the way through that particular period of the 1890s. So George Washington Murray left Congress. He was from South Carolina in 1897. The last Black to serve in Congress until the 1930s was George White from North Carolina. He left in 1901, and that's the last Black to serve until the 1930s when the priest, Oscar de la Priest from Illinois.
Yeah. So this is fascinating. So of the members, so there was a Richard Kane.
Yes.
From South Carolina. He served in the U.S. House and U.S. Senate.
He was a minister. In fact, Kane was an AME. My memory serves, he may have been bishop.
Yeah, I believe he was. He was. He was an AME church. And I believe he was a bishop. That is correct. We South Carolina also. We mentioned Robert Elliott, who was in Congress. There was, and as I'm looking at all the representatives, there was Robert Smalls, who was a state senator, but also a member of Congress.
Yeah, he stated Robert Smalls, to me, is the most consequential South Carolinian to ever live.
Okay.
And I can make that case. Now, there are a lot of people will talk about John C. Calhoun. They may even talk about Strom Thurmond and a bunch of people, but I can make the case that Robert Smalls was the most consequential South Carolinian ever. And I believe that very strongly.
Well, tell us about that, because I want people to hear that history. Make the case, if you would.
Well, Robert Smalls was born into slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Born in Beaufort, South Carolina. His mother was a slave. They were in the possession of the McGee family. And Robert Smalls, when he was only 12 years old, John McGee, I believe was his first name, McGee started to fall on hard times. Things were not going well for him. He then sent Robert Smalls to Charleston to work on the waterfront.
Mm-hmm.
And he was only 12. He worked on the waterfront, and under the deal back then, slaves could be farmed out, and whatever income they made went back to the master. So Robert Smalls was working the Charleston waterfront, and the money was going to his master, John McGee, back in Beaufort. Well, Robert Smalls, true to the book that was written by Andrew Billingsley, a former president of Morgan State, Andrew Billingsley came down to South Carolina and spent 2 or 3 years here. And the whole time he was here as a professor over at the University of South Carolina, he did research and ended up writing a book on Robert Smalls. And the book is entitled Yearning to Breathe Free.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an apt description of Robert Smalls.
Mm-hmm.
So while Robert Smalls was working there on the waterfront, he was yearning to be a free man. He started studying the currents. He was observant of the captain of the ship. The ship was named the Planter. And he was working on that ship, observing how the captain ran the ship, learning how the currents of the Charleston Harbor. He was listening to the whistles as the captain used the whistles to signal certain things for the ship to pass. And he was watching the habits of the captain and everybody working there. So Robert Smalls, after he thought he had learned enough, one night, he noticed that the captain and everybody on the ship, they weren't paying attention to them. They were slaves, and he thought ignorant. And so, like every Friday night or Saturday night, I don't remember which one it was, but on the weekends, they would go into town, leave the ship to the slaves. And they would all go into town and participate in whatever activities, most of which was a lot of drinking. So one night, when they all went to town, they left nobody on the ship but the slaves. Robert Smalls absconded the Planter. And he planned it well. Everybody on board wouldn't go with him, but everybody who wanted to go, he took them with him. And because he knew what whistles sounds to make, as he passed Fort Sumter, he pulled the whistles and was waved through, because the people at Fort Sumter, who was supposed to be guarding the harbor, thought the ship was being manned by the captain, and he gave it safe passage. Because he knew the currents, he knew exactly how to get that ship out of the Charleston Harbor. He stopped up in the north, what's now North Charleston, picked up his wife, children, and a few more friends, and went on to deliver that ship to the Union soldiers. And to reward him, he was given $1,500 in cash and his freedom. And Robert Smalls turned that $1,500 into great wealth. and he became a member of Congress. Now, before he became a member of the House of Representatives here and Congress, Robert Smalls, in the company of a Presbyterian minister, now his freedom, it was like 1862 in March, the spring of 1862 when he did this. That following August, he, in the company of a Presbyterian minister, went to Washington and sat down with Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln.
Wow.
Abraham Lincoln, you may recall, was a big advocate for Black folks being inducted into the Army to fight for their own freedom. On the Union side, they were not allowed to do so until it looked like the North might lose the war, and they needed manpower. So they made the case. Abraham Lincoln entertained Frederick Douglass and Robert Smalls. They made the case for Blacks going into the Army to fight for their own freedom. Robert Smalls was authorized to come back to South Carolina and recruit Blacks to serve in the Army. He was authorized to get up to 40,000 Black troops, which he did. Think about that.
Wow.
He came back to South Carolina, recruited up to 40,000 Black people to fight for their own freedoms. He continued to work on that ship because he was inducted into the Army, because even back then, because he didn't know how to read and write, he was not allowed to go into the Navy, but he was inducted into the Army, and then the Army assigned him to the naval ship, to the Navy. And he helped them win the war by knowing the currents in the Charleston Harbor, and then, of course, 40,000 troops. And a lot of historians say that's what made the difference in winning the war, those 40,000 Black people that were inducted into the Army by Robert Smalls. Now, what's more consequential than that?
Right.
Now, he follows all of that by getting elected to the South Carolina legislature, where he served for 10 years. He followed that by getting elected to the United States Congress, where he served another 10 years. The backdrop to all of this, Robert Smalls was a member of the Constitutional Convention of 1868, I believe it was, or 66. That is when, remember the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, then South Carolina had this Constitutional Convention to figure out how all this is going to get done. And of course, he was a member of that convention. Robert Smalls was also a member of the 1895 Constitutional Convention. Now, what is so amazing about this, he got his freedom codified in 1868 convention. He got his freedom taken away from him in the 1895 convention. According to my research, he was one of only two people who went to both conventions.
Yeah. That's an incredible story.
Well, there's one other story I want to tell you about Robert Smalls.
Please.
So Robert Smalls goes back to Beaufort. By this time, John McGee was really in bad shape. Lost all of his wealth. His wife took ill. Robert Smalls bought the house that he was a slave in and brought the widow of McGee into that home and took care of her till she died.
Wow. That's something else. Yeah, no, I agree with you. He of all the folk, he was definitely the most consequential I'm just going to lift up a couple other names before we go, since we're on South Carolina. Alonzo Ranzier. He was in Congress. And he was also Ranzier. He was also Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina from December 1870 to December 1872. So you all had a black lieutenant governor even then. And folks, this is the point. This was the power of Reconstruction. There were thousands of black elected officials, and that's why they took it away, because we were cleaning up. And lastly, Jonathan Wright, state senator and first black associate justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court, 1870 to 1877. Things that, would be unheard of today, so to speak, in terms of the way. But that's where we were, and that's what we got.
Well, we had a second lieutenant governor too, R.J. Gleaves, I believe was his name.
Okay.
And Secretary of State, State Treasurer. There was a black state treasurer. There's an interesting story about him, Cardoza.
Francis Lewis Cardoza, yeah.
Francis Lewis Cardoza was state treasurer. A lot of people don't know it, but Cardoza High School in Washington, D.C. was named for Francis Cardoza, who escaped from South Carolina. I say escaped because when they were, way in Hampton, who people are now talking a little bit about, and I think we're going to have some adjustments made to South Carolina history, and Pitchfork Ben Tillman, all of these people, they drove black people out of South Carolina to keep them from holding office because their numbers were too big. And so Francis Cardoza left and went to Washington, D.C. A very smart guy, highly educated. And he kind of became one of the top educators in Washington, D.C. And subsequently, Cardoza High School was built and named in his honor.
Yes,
now, a lot of people think that Cardoza High School was named for a former Associate Justice of the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
But no, it was Francis Lewis Cardoza.
Yeah, a lot of people do think that, they think it was named after Benjamin, but it was named after Francis Lewis. You're absolutely right.
Right.
This is what we wanted. We wanted folk to hear you flex that history muscle of yours. And folks, it's important because as far as I'm concerned, Congressman Clyburn is continuing in a tradition in terms of Black South Carolinians who struggled and fought their way to represent their community. And that struggle's not over. So to me, he's a direct link to that history that he's just shared with us. And we are more than thankful for that. Congressman, I know you don't call yourself a historian, but you've taught. So, Professor, thank you.
Thank you.
It's a
Appreciate
pleasure
being here.
Happy Juneteenth to you.
Same to you, my man.
All right.
God, you are our refuge. Send our ancestors to guard our doors. Cast out this virus from our communities and our bodies. Heal, bless, and protect everyone listening and their loved ones. Thank you for listening to Make It Plain and Get Woke. Remember to listen, like, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. If all minds are clear, it has been made plain.